Between 1929 and 1933, U.S. industrial production plunged nearly 46%, and unemployment surged to 24.9%. The price paid for a decade of unchecked overproduction. Factories, farms, and banks had churned out more goods and credit than markets could absorb. Inventories ballooned, prices collapsed, and bankruptcies swept across towns and cities. 2 generations later, the pattern returned. In 2009, the IMF recorded world GDP contracting by 0.1% and U.S. unemployment spiking near 10% as housing and manufacturing gluts met overextended credit. In this video, we trace the slow build-up, years of rising capacity, swollen inventory-to-sales ratios, and loose lending. Using official Fed, BLS, and IMF data to pinpoint the exact moment's excess turned into collapse. Watch to see the measurable warning signs economists missed, the cascading numbers that tell the story, and the concrete lessons businesses and policymakers must learn to prevent the next ruinous oversupply. Price collapse, global surplus devaluing food and ruining farmers. FAO and World Bank data document that global agricultural output has outpaced consumption in several major commodity chains, creating persistent surpluses that translate directly into lower international prices. Approximately 500 million smallholder farms worldwide produce a large share of staple crops, and in sub-Saharan Africa, those smallholders contribute up to 80% of the region's food supply, according to FAO reporting. Post-harvest losses remain high in many low-income countries. Commonly cited ranges from about 20 to 40% for perishables. So even as gross production rises, usable supplies and farmer revenues can diverge sharply. Official crop balance sheets from FAO and National Agriculture Ministries show rising stocks-to-use ratios for cereals and oilseeds in surplus years, and those inventory buildups exert sustained downward pressure on market quotations. The chain of events is straightforward and relentless. Rising yields and expanded acreage delivered by technology, fertilizer availability, and improved seed varieties pushed aggregate output higher. Trade liberalization and logistics improvements made markets more integrated, and when global demand did not absorb the extra tons, exporters and traders moved surplus onto world markets. Because commodities are fungible, a glut in one exporting region depresses prices everywhere. And USDA and FAO monitoring explain how storage costs and long lead times mean producers often receive the brunt of the adjustment. Farm gate prices collapse faster than retail prices fall, creating a squeeze. Input costs, debt service, and fixed overheads remain, while the price for the crop plunges. The result is not just lower profits, but, in many cases, operating losses recorded by agricultural ministries and industry associations. Policy responses documented by OECD, the World Bank, and FAO tended to be reactive, not preventive. Governments have used emergency purchases, temporary subsidies, export restrictions, and set-aside payments to stabilize domestic markets. Measures that often reduce immediate pain but can worsen global oversupply or delay the price recovery. Biofuel mandates and industrial demand shifts amplify the cycle in some commodities when policy suddenly redirected volumes. When those outlets contracted, prices collapsed again. Trade dispute filings to the WTO and public ministry reports show how export dumping accusations and retaliatory barriers have frequently followed episodes of sharp price decline, further distorting signals that farmers rely upon when deciding what and how much to plant. For producers, the human toll shows up in shrinking farm incomes, rising indebtedness, and accelerating structural change. World Bank analyses emphasize that agriculture remains a primary pathway out of poverty in many low-income countries. When prices fall below production costs, the most vulnerable smallholders cannot bridge the gap. Some commercial farms respond by intensifying storage and processing investments, others by cutting production or exiting the sector, and many rural households move toward off-farm work as a survival strategy. FAO and development agencies recommend measures that directly address the mechanics of surplus-driven collapse. Better post-harvest storage and cold chains, targeted safety nets for income smoothing, improved market information systems, and investments in value-adding processing that reduce the need to sell raw output into depressed bulk markets. Systemic fragility. Why markets built for scarcity fail under abundance. Data from major agencies makes the mechanism painfully clear. Production capacity expanded faster than demand across multiple sectors, and official statistics captured the mismatch before the collapse became undeniable. The World Steel Association records show that one region came to produce more than half of global crude steel output, creating a persistent supply overhang that depressed prices and squeezed margins worldwide. Meanwhile, energy agencies reported that increases in unconventional oil and gas output added millions of barrels per day to global supplies, swamping demand growth and triggering sharp price adjustments. The UN Food and Agriculture Organization documented surpluses in several staple crops that pushed the FAO food price index downward, eroding farm incomes in exporting countries. Firms reacted to abundance in ways that revealed systemic design flaws. Big manufacturers had built business models around high-capacity utilization and scarcity-driven pricing. Their fixed cost structures assumed stable or rising prices. When large-scale overproduction drove prices below break-even levels, profit margins vanished. Inventory stacks grew. Credit lines that underpinned capacity expansion were suddenly at risk. Lenders tightened. Corporations that had optimized for efficiency under scarcity. Lean inventories, just-in-time logistics, and heavy capital investment found themselves exposed to prolonged low-price environments. This mismatch between organizational design and market reality produced cascading balance sheet stress, not just for producers, but for banks and pension funds that held related exposures. Regulatory and trade responses documented by international bodies amplified the drama. Governments and trade authorities invoked anti-dumping and safeguard measures after official trade data showed persistent global surpluses. The World Trade Organization Forum and trade ministries published complaints and investigations that centered on excess capacity as the proximate driver of distorted price signals. Central banks and the IMF raised alarms about deflationary pressures and fiscal strains in commodity-dependent economies. Those institutions' public reports linked falling export revenues directly to sustained oversupply and the resulting deterioration of sovereign balance sheets. Short-term policy fixes, tariffs, production quotas, emergency credit, stabilized some firms, but often did not address the underlying disconnect between how markets allocate capital under scarcity assumptions and how they behave when abundance becomes the norm. The human and institutional fallout followed a discernible arc that official bankruptcy records and employment statistics corroborate. Initially, market share became the primary weapon. Firms discounted aggressively to move stock, betting on scale and endurance. Next came rounds of consolidation documented in corporate filings and antitrust reviews, as weaker producers were absorbed or closed. Then credit stress translated into solvency crises for leveraged firms. Regulators' financial stability reports list asset quality deterioration tied to sectoral price collapses. Finally, policy interventions shifted from market-friendly adjustments to more direct support. Export credits, restructuring plans, and in some cases, industrial policy aimed at capacity rationalization. Throughout, the root problem remained structural. Institutions, contracts, and financial models engineered for a scarcity-dominated equilibrium could not adapt quickly to persistent abundance without creating new instabilities. Environmental strain, depleting soil and water for food that ends up as waste. FAO data put a stark number on what would otherwise be an abstract tragedy. Roughly one-third of all food produced for human consumption, about 1.3 billion tons, is lost or wasted each year. That single figure sits at the head of a cascade of measurable environmental impacts. Agriculture consumes roughly 70% of global freshwater withdrawals, according to FAO and World Bank assessments. When one-third of production never reaches a human plate, a proportionate share of that freshwater, along with the fertilizer, energy, and land used to grow it, is effectively flushed away. The sequence played out predictably across landscapes and supply chains. Farmers expanded irrigation and pushed yields higher to meet market signals and policy incentives. Governments and corporations supported intensive inputs to chase productivity. More irrigated acres and heavier fertilizer applications delivered surpluses, but markets, storage systems, and consumer behaviors did not absorb them efficiently. The result: produce left in fields, rotting in transit, or disposed of at retail and household levels. Embedded in that waste is not just calories, but water. The virtual water footprint of wasted food is enormous, and the soil resources erode under repeated, unnecessary cultivation. Soil condition metrics from the UN and FAO reinforce the human cost. FAO assessments show that about one-third of the world's soils are degraded to some degree through erosion, compaction, loss of organic matter, salinization, and chemical contamination. Intensive cropping and frequent cultivation of marginal lands accelerate those processes. In regions where irrigation drew down groundwater to sustain overproduction, aquifers show clear signs of depletion. In the North American Great Plains, for example, long-term groundwater extraction from the Ogallala Aquifer has led to measurable declines in water tables in many states, documented by USGS data, creating a pressure point where continued overproduction compromises future yield and water availability. The environmental toll multiplies when greenhouse gas accounting is considered. FAO's analyses attribute roughly 8% of global greenhouse gas emissions to food that is lost or wasted, a proportion large enough to rival entire national economies. Those emissions are tied not only to decomposition in landfills, but to the upstream inputs: nitrogen fertilizers that generate nitrous oxide, diesel used in field operations, and energy for irrigation and processing. Add the lost capacity of degraded soils to sequester carbon as organic matter is exhausted, and the feedback loop becomes clear. Overproduction that generates waste undermines the very biological capital needed to grow food sustainably. Concrete examples make the numbers visceral. Perishable fruits and vegetables are disproportionately wasted because of cold chain gaps and aesthetic standards at retail. Whole supply chains invest water and fertilizer to produce items that are rejected for shape or size. Livestock feed production consumes vast tracts of cropland and large volumes of water. When feed crops are overproduced or directed inefficiently, the embedded land and water go to waste along with the animal products. In many river basins, irrigation withdrawals for crops destined partly for waste have reduced downstream flows, increased salinity in irrigated soils, and intensified competition among users for dwindling water supplies. Policy and technological responses that target waste reduction show the practical leverage this story offers. Interventions like improved storage and transport, market reforms to reduce cosmetic rejection, and consumer-level behavior change can cut the wasted share and thereby reduce pressure on soil and water resources. Official analyses by FAO and UNEP show that modest reductions in food loss and waste would translate into measurable water savings and slower expansion into fragile lands. At the same time, soil restoration practices, cover cropping, reduced tillage, targeted nutrient management can recover productivity on degraded fields and lower the need to bring new land into production. The unfolding narrative is not inevitable. Official evidence ties the environmental degradation directly to decisions made across production systems and markets. Reducing surplus-driven cultivation and redirecting inputs to maintain soil health and conserve freshwater can break the cycle. Facts and figures from international bodies underline the scale of the problem and point to where interventions produce the biggest returns. Cut waste, and you can conserve a third of food production's water and soil footprint. Improve soil stewardship, and you protect the base that supports future yields. The past pattern of overproduction, followed by waste, left soils eroded and aquifers stressed. The present offers data-driven pathways to reverse those trends before the next cycle of depletion becomes irreversible. Survival paradox: how infinite growth creates new ecological vulnerabilities. The IPCC reports that average global temperatures are already about 1.9 degrees C above pre-industrial levels, a rise driven in large measure by greenhouse gas emissions from relentless industrial production and material extraction. The UN International Resource Panel documented roughly 92 billion tons of materials extracted globally in 2017, illustrating the sheer scale of throughput that underpins modern growth models. Such figures are not abstract. They're the measurable output of an economic logic that treats natural sinks and ecosystems as unlimited inputs and disposable outputs. This mismatch between physical limits and economic ambition creates direct stresses on air, water, and soil, and seeds vulnerabilities that compound over time. Fishery data from the UN Food and Agriculture Organization underscores the human cost of production pushed beyond sustainable limits. About a third of global fish stocks were assessed as overfished in the last comprehensive reporting cycle, with industrial fleets continuing to target depleted populations. The collapse of the northern cod fisheries and the Fisheries and Oceans Canada moratorium that followed is an emblematic case. Entire communities lost livelihoods when biological productivity failed to match harvest pressures. Short-term gains were converted into long-term decline. Recovery has been slow and uneven, and economies that relied on steady catches were left exposed to unemployment, migration, and the erosion of local institutions. Deforestation and biodiversity loss follow a similar arc. FAO's Global Forest Resources Assessment documents net forest losses measured in millions of hectares per year, driven by agricultural expansion, timber extraction, and infrastructure development catering to mass production. The IUCN Red List records tens of thousands of species at elevated risk of extinction, and the World Health Organization cautions that roughly 3/4 of emerging infectious diseases are zoonotic, many facilitated by habitat disruption and intensified human-wildlife contact. In short bursts of activity, clearing for crops, widening roads, ecosystems are simplified, resilience is reduced, and new pathways open for shocks that ripple through food systems, human health, and markets. The logistical architecture built to support infinite growth amplifies fragility. Global supply chains optimized for cost and speed rely on finely balanced, just-in-time inventories and concentrated production nodes. World Bank and OECD analyses of recent crises show how localized ecological shocks, flooding of a factory region, drought-reducing crop yields, or disease outbreaks in livestock can cascade into global shortages and price spikes. The pandemic-era supply disruptions offered a stark demonstration. When production hubs falter, highly integrated systems transmit failure rapidly, producing acute shortages in essentials and non-essentials alike. Efficiency substituted for redundancy, and that trade-off became painfully visible. Feedback loops make the paradox worse. Continued overproduction feeds emissions and land conversion, which in turn produce climate extremes that damage productive capacity. The IPCC warns of increased frequency and intensity of heat waves, droughts, and heavy precipitation, events that erode crop yields, diminish water availability, and degrade infrastructure. FAO and UNEP note that food systems are both major contributors to and victims of climate change. Decreased agricultural reliability raises the temptation to intensify production further. More inputs, more land, which only deepens ecological stress. Economic signals that reward scale and throughput thus incentivize adaptation strategies that are themselves maladaptive over the long run. Policy and management responses already recognize that the survival paradox requires systemic repair. International bodies have advanced frameworks, sustainable fisheries management guidelines, land restoration initiatives under the UN Convention to combat desertification, and circular economy principles promoted by bodies such as the European Commission and UNEP to decouple economic activity from linear extraction and waste. These approaches aim to rebuild buffers, diversified landscapes, regulated harvests, restored natural capital, and production systems designed for resilience over maximal output. The challenge is practical and political as much as technical. Reversing the momentum of systems built around perpetual expansion demands coordinated governance, capital reallocation, and institutional shifts that align incentives with ecological limits. We close this story where it began, in the years of unchecked expansion when factories ran night shifts, ports overflowed with containers, and planners equated growth with more output. That excess built inventories that outpaced demand, sent prices plunging and profits evaporating. When crude oil, for example, fell from roughly $110 a barrel in mid-2014 to about $30 by early 2016, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration, entire sectors were forced to retrench. When housing and credit excess burst a decade earlier, U.S. unemployment climbed toward 10% in 2009, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, a human cost tied directly to gluts, defaults, and collapsing investment. The lessons are simple and stark. Overproduction creates fragile markets. Inventory gluts depress prices and profits. Bankruptcies and layoffs follow, and policy responses that arrive late deepen the downturn. Official data from central banks and international agencies show these patterns repeating across commodities, manufacturing, and real estate. Fixing them requires more than stimulus alone. It demands smarter capacity planning, better demand forecasting, stronger financial buffers, and international cooperation to prevent a race to the bottom. You've seen how decisions made years ago ripple into the present, affecting jobs, prices, and the choices you make as a consumer and voter. If this matters to you, stay engaged. Check the sources we've cited, talk to your representatives about prudent industrial policy, and hold companies accountable for sustainable production. In our next episode, we'll examine concrete solutions, from inventory analytics and counter-cyclical policy to case studies where restraint restored stability, and hear from the policymakers and CEOs who are trying to get it right. Subscribe, share this story, and join the conversation, because preventing the next crash starts with understanding the price of excess.